So I should begin by saying that I actually really like Lafayette's paper here. And it's not because I agree with everything that he says. In fact, I disagree vociferously with what he considers are good objections to his view and what he considers are bad objections. And you'll see that later. But what I really like about Lafayette's paper is that he essentially is bringing up something that Tom Regan brings up in the lesson called The Jungle, which is that social movements, have to sort of go through this ridicule stage. First there's ridicule, then there's discussion, and then there's adoption. And I think something like this might be true of what Lafayette is talking about. Because at one point, for example, getting rid of child labor, that seemed ridiculous. And now it seems morally abhorrent that we ever allowed for child labor. So it might be the case that what Lafayette is arguing for, even if it seems initially off-putting, I'm not entirely sure that it's impossible that we'll see this in the future. And that's why I like this paper so much. It's almost, I don't know, it might be one of those things that does end up happening or something like it. So Lafayette 1980 argues that we should regulate potentially harmful activities. Parenting could be one of these potentially harmful activities, particularly to children. Hence, we should regulate child rearing in the form of requiring licenses in order to legally raise a child. So he arrives at this conclusion, and yes, we'll cover objections, but he arrives at this conclusion through pretty, it seems, innocuous assumptions and criterion. Or criteria. So here's the first assumption. Pretty straightforward. Any activity that is potentially harmful to others and requires certain demonstrated competence for its safe performance is subject to regulation. So we require of people that they, get a license before they can drive a vehicle. And of course, vehicles are simply 2-ton weapons. I mean, if you want to use them that way, they can be. So sure, if you are a bad driver, you are a potential harm to others. That's why we require that you show your competence before we allow you to be behind the wheel. That seems pretty straightforward. If we also have a reliable procedure for determining whether someone has the requisite competence, then the action is not only subject to regulation, but ought, all things considered, to be regulated. So he makes, part of his assumption is that it is actually a moral requirement of societies, I guess, of us, to regulate those activities that we do have some way for measuring whether or not the person has the competence to carry out the task at hand. So that's Lafayette's initial assumption, a two-parter, but it's definitely, it seems like a pretty straightforward assumption. It's hard to really argue with this, especially because we have other tasks in society or roles in society that we do require this of. So it seems pretty commonsensical to request this, right? To lay this down as a foundational principle. So then he gives two criteria for regulation, and it seems pretty straightforward too. Parenting is an activity potentially very harmful to children. I don't have to tell you to imagine bad parents and to realize that that's very, very harmful for children. And similarly, here's a second criterion. A parent must be competent if he or she is to avoid harming his children. Even greater competence is required if he is to do the job well. But not everyone has this minimal competence. Many people lack the knowledge needed to rear children adequately. Many others lack the requisite energy, temperament, or stability. So there's many factors that contribute to, rearing children well, and not everyone has them, right? So based off those two premises, he's going to go ahead and say, yeah, we should have parenting licenses, and it is a moral requirement that we do this. Otherwise, we are letting children be harmed. Okay, well, we should cover some objections to his view. These are objections that he considers. So let's begin with the one theoretical objection that that I'm actually covering from him. So here is a little ghost here. That's a skeptic. He gives multiple objections. That's why the slide says objections. I'm only covering this one though. So here's the inalienable rights objection. Licensing is unacceptable, someone might say, since people have a right to have children, just as they have rights to free speech and free religious expression. Now at this point, Lafayette goes into, he kind of derides, the whole idea of having a right to children for a second. And he goes, in multiple directions. I'm going to kind of skip most of that. And I'm going to just get down to this question, which is ultimately the point of the discussion that he's having in the paper. What does having a right to children even mean? So this is a good question. If someone is saying we have a right to children, I think you are perfectly justified in asking, what do you mean by that? And Lafayette considers two interpretations that are just pretty clearly nonsense. So here they are. It is implausible to claim either that infertile people have rights to be given children, or that people have rights to intentionally create children biologically without incurring any subsequent responsibility to them. So, one interpretation is, yeah, everyone has a right to a child. Even if you can't have one biologically, you have a right to a child, you should be given one. So number one is clearly just, that isn't, no one really believes that if you're infertile, you still have a right to a child somehow. Number two is also not really plausible. When we say, you have a right to procreate, also implied in there is, but you have to treat the child well, raise the child well. So it isn't just that, you can create as many children as you want without any responsibility to them. It's more than that. So 1 and 2 are clearly not good interpretations. And so what does it really mean to say you have a right to children? Well, Lafayette says this. A third interpretation, however, is more plausible, particularly when coupled with observations about the degree of intrusion into one's life that the licensing scheme represents. On this interpretation, people have a right to rear children if they make good faith efforts to rear procreated children the best way they see fit. So, even if you were to believe in something like a right to children, the only plausible interpretation of that is including, that you will make good faith efforts to actually raise the child well. So he says, well, none of that. Even if you do believe in a right to children, it doesn't actually exclude his licensing scheme. As a matter of fact, it would be a way to ensure that you don't abuse your right to a child, right? So he goes further here to kind of deal with the objection more clearly. And I think it's a good quote here, so I'm going to go ahead and, let me set this up. Question. On this interpretation of right to children, would licensing be too much of an intrusion into the lives of sincere applicants? So we're saying, the licensing scheme would be a good way to make sure people don't abuse their own rights. But is it too much of an intrusion, right? Is the state intervening too much? And so here is what Lafayette says. Undoubtedly, one should be wary of unnecessary governmental intervention into individuals' lives. Those granted licenses would face merely minor intervention. Only those denied licenses would encounter marked intrusion. So he's saying, okay, yes, I completely admit that we should be nervous about government intervention, but really, the licensing scheme he's thinking of, it's not really going to affect people very much. Only the ones that are denied would be really negatively affected. They would have to reapply and maybe update some of their child rearing practices. But most people would agree those are good things that they did, right? If they're improving their parenting skills before they're actually granted a parenting license, that sounds like a good idea. This encroachment, however, is a necessary side effect of licensing parents, just as it is for automobile and vocational licensing. So if someone didn't pass, for example, the bar, right, to be a lawyer, well, go back and study some more, and then maybe you'll pass next time. Or if someone didn't pass their driving test, well, go keep driving, keep practicing, and then maybe you'll get your license next time, right? Same thing for licensing parents. Is it an intrusion? Yeah, if you fail, and it's good that we're actually requiring of you that you actually gain the competence needed to, acquire the license you're looking for. So he continues, consequently, we come to a somewhat weaker interpretation of this right claim. A person has a right to rear children if he meets certain minimal standards of child rearing. Parents must not abuse or neglect their children and must also provide for the basic needs of the children. This claim of right is certainly more credible than the previously canvassed alternatives, though some people might still reject this claim in situations where exercise of the right would lead to negative consequences, for example, to overpopulation. So I include this, last part from Lafayette for a pretty important reason. I mean, he's not saying that the licensing system is the end all be all of parenting. There's still other things we have to think about. He's still thinking about consequences in general. So, overpopulation is still something that you can add into the mix. But what he's making is kind of a really weak claim. It's just saying if someone has demonstrated that they are not competent to be parents, well, then it's not clear that we should let them become parents. So on that interpretation, it almost seems like, it makes it seem like licensing parents is kind of an obvious moral requisite of society. Okay, let me go here into practical objections. So just on how the actual licensing scheme would work. And I'm deliberately making this controversial because the paper is controversial. So I'm going to show you some pictures that are going to bother you, and I'm doing it on purpose. So I just want you to know that. So, okay, here's another objection. There may not be, or we may not be able to discover, adequate criteria of a good parent. This is a pretty good objection. It's basically saying, hey, are you really sure that you can tell good parents from bad parents, right? There are some recent books, such as Do Parents Matter by, I believe it's Levine and Levine, that basically says there is no good science of parenting. There might be one, but we don't have it yet. We don't actually know what good parenting really looks like. Interestingly enough, this book and this picture is, I'll let you enjoy that picture for a second. But the book that I'm talking about by Levine and Levine, Do Parents Matter, that's a newer book, and this paper is now over 30 years old, the one by Lafayette that we're talking about. Lafayette is already making a good point that even Levine and Levine do also, say, which is the following. Although we do not have infallible criteria for picking out good parents, we undoubtedly can identify bad ones, those who abuse or neglect their children. For example, we do not wonder if a parent who severely beats or neglects a child is adequate. We know that person isn't. So what Lafayette is saying is, maybe we can't tell great parents from good parents, right? But you know a bad parent. And even if the licensing scheme only got, basically disabled these bad parents from having children, but that would already be a good thing. Even if those are, it's a small amount of good consequences, it's still better consequences to not let bad parents have kids. So that's Lafayette's, overall consequentialist, oriented reasoning, even if you can't, maximize good parenting, you can at least minimize bad parenting. And that's a good point. So that's one of his responses. Let's look at another objection. There is no reliable way to predict who will maltreat their children. Without an accurate predictive test, licensing would be not only unjust, but also a waste of time. So this is where it comes in handy to look at 30-year-old papers, because I'll let you enjoy that picture for a second. But we actually do have some ways of predicting bad parenting, and even Lafayette had some available to him back in 1980. So here's what he says, and it's 2 points. So let me give you this first point. Lafayette first argues that it would be improper to require that tests be 100% accurate. Procedures for licensing drivers, physicians, lawyers, druggists, etc. plainly are not 100% or anywhere near 100% accurate. Presumably, we recognize these deficiencies yet embrace the procedures anyway. So if you're saying, hey, you'll never find a test that actually works, what Lafayette is saying, yeah, none of the tests we have work 100% of the time. So physicians get sued for malpractice, lawyers get debarred. I mean, these things happen. But the idea here is, once again, try to get some of in the very least, the low-hanging fruit. Those people who clearly shouldn't be licensed to be physicians, to be lawyers, or to be parents. So you can't set the bar so high. Setting the bar a little bit lower does result in some positive consequences, and that's a good thing. If you can, get some more positive consequences anywhere, good, get them. That's his first point. The second point is this, and I'll also let you enjoy that picture. Moreover, researchers at Nashville General Hospital have developed a brief interview questionnaire which seems to have significant predictive value. However, my point is not to argue about the precise reliability of present tests. I cannot say emphatically that we now have accurate predictive tests. Nevertheless, even if such tests are not available, we could undoubtedly develop them. So there is some progress on that front. Of course, that's more so for like a human development class. So I'll let you ask your teachers about that, your HDEV teachers about that. In any case, Lafayette does make a pretty good response, I think, to that objection. Even if all we grab is the low-hanging fruit, that's still a good thing, and we should. Okay, another objection. Even if a reliable test for ascertaining who would be an acceptable parent were available, administrators would unintentionally misuse that test. So this is related to the next objection. So let me just go ahead and, first let me let you enjoy the picture, which I don't even know what's going on here, but this objection can be dispensed with fairly easily unless one assumes there is some special reason to believe that more mistakes will be made in administering parenting licenses than in other regulatory activities. So here Lafayette is saying, yeah, look, again, unless you think that driving licenses and, any kind of vocational license for lawyers and for doctors, unless you think that, there's a special reason to believe that parenting license will have more mistakes than those, then this isn't really a good objection. It's almost like an imaginary objection. What are you arguing against? Is there any evidence of this yet? So that's how he takes care of this objection. But it does go into or connect with the next objection, which I think is a better one, although Lafayette doesn't think it's a very good one. So here's number 4. Any testing procedure will be intentionally abused. People administering the process will disqualify people they dislike or people who espouse views they dislike from rearing children. So you can imagine either ethnic or racial prejudice, or maybe religious bigotry. You might deny someone, I don't know, a parenting license because they're a religion that you don't really like, or something like that. So this is a possibility, and Lafayette doesn't seem to take it very seriously. The response to this objection is parallel to the response to the previous objection, namely, that there is no reason to believe that the licensing of parents is more likely to be abused than driver's license tests or other regulatory procedures. Yeah, but then again, here are my 2 cents. It's hard to say that. It really is, because if you look at our nation's history, authorities have reliably used prejudicial criteria in administering various different policies. I mean, it's just a regular occurrence. And these are things that we will cover in this class, right? So, surveillance. It seems that even though authorities had the capacity to surveil many, many groups, they, in practice, only really surveilled leftist groups, civil rights activists, anyone that opposed the war in Vietnam. That's sort of what they did, and they didn't really surveil as much as they could have. For example, white terror groups, right? So white supremacy terror groups. So that kind of shows you that's not great evidence that authorities won't abuse this licensing scheme. Same thing with housing. So you can look at this book and see how housing policies were extremely racially biased. There's also the war on drugs, which Michelle Alexander writes is a new form of social control. And so when you keep seeing this and how policies are administered in a, how about this, less than impartial way, let's say that, it doesn't look very good. So there's also something that we don't really talk about in this class, but free market versus protectionist policies. So both the US and the UK, early on in their commercial economies, utilized a series of protectionist policies, right? They would protect their own industries from, international trade, essentially. And both Sven Beckert, who writes in the book Empire of Cotton, as well as kind of a leftist radical, Eduardo Galeano, kind of make the case that these two typically considered capitalist countries, the UK and the US, did this, and this is very non-capitalist, and they found it okay to do it. But when Latin American countries tried to do the same thing, they intervened in any way possible, including militarily. So again, this is examples of the government unfairly kind of meeting out its policies. It says, well, we want a free market, but when they were coming up, they didn't actually use the free market ideology. But now that the U.S. economy is fully developed and other countries want to use some protectionist strategies, the U.S. won't let them. And so there's something kind of it's not kind of, it's very inconsistent. So these are examples of how the government doesn't always mete out its policies impartially. And that seems to be clearly unfair. And it seems to be an objection that Lafayette doesn't really, consider sufficiently, I would say. So that's just one thing I wanted to say. And I don't think he addresses that objection very well. He does come up with one more objection, the one that he thinks is a serious objection. Here's what he says, an objection to his view. We could never adequately, reasonably, and fairly enforce such a program. That is, even if we could establish a reasonable and fair way of determining which people would be inadequate parents, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to enforce the program. Well, this is a good point too, and I do believe it is a good objection. I just think it's not the only good objection. So here is what Lafayette says. How would one deal with violators? And what could we do with babies so conceived? These are difficult problems here, no doubt, but they are not insurmountable. We might not punish parents at all, We might just remove the children and put them up for adoption. However, even if we are presently uncertain about the precise way to establish a just and effective form of enforcement, I do not see why this should undermine my licensing proposal. If it is important enough to protect children from being maltreated by parents, then surely a reasonable enforcement procedure can be secured. At least we should assume one can be unless someone shows that it cannot. So what he's saying here is, has he worked out all the kinks? No. But we haven't shown that it won't work. So in the very least, we should try it and then, protect the children that we can protect and then try to improve on it and tinker with it, right? Maybe it's not going to work perfectly right off the bat, but most government policies don't, right? So it's something that we just kind of keep working on. He does also add this important point that I'm going to tie into, the gay rights movement. So there was much opposition to allowing gay couples to adopt children, and all kinds of things were said, of course, and I won't get into that right now. But just think about the rigorous process that couples that want to adopt children have to go through. I mean, they have to jump, especially if you're a gay couple, you have to jump through all kinds of hoops. You might call it red tape, but it seems justified because if you're going to take care of children, you should, have an adequate environment for that task. But now think about all that we require of adoptive parents and how we require exactly none of that of actual biological parents. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, more than half of all pregnancies are unplanned. That means that that's what more than half means. Most biological parents have put in less preparation, one might say, than adoptive parents. And that's extremely telling. Once these features of our adoption policies are clearly identified, it becomes quite apparent that there are striking parallels between the general licensing program I have advocated and our present adoption system. Both programs have the same aim, protecting children. Both have the same drawbacks and are subject to the same abuses. The only obvious dissimilarity is that the adoption requirements are more rigorous than those proposed for the general licensing program. So even Lafollete is saying it would still be harder to become an adoptive parent than a biological parent. That's showing you that he really is setting a low bar. He doesn't think it can be perfect, certainly not in the beginning, but we could still protect many, many children through this licensing scheme. So I close here with something that will tie into the rest of the lesson here, and it's this. Why do most of us find this proposal unpalatable? And I'm going to be honest with you, that's why I chose this paper, because it was so surprising. I was like, no, that's really bad. So what's so bad about this? And Lafollete makes an interesting suggestion, and I really think that he's at least partially right. So here's what he says. I suspect the answer is found in a long-held, deeply ingrained attitude toward children, repeatedly reaffirmed in recent court decisions, and present, at least to some degree, in almost all of us. The belief is that parents own, or at least have natural sovereignty over, their children. This belief is abhorrent and needs to be supplanted with a more child-centered view. This does seem to be kind of the default position. So we'll talk more about that right now.